whispers through bone.
The desert was a vast and unyielding sea of sand, stretching endlessly beneath an indifferent sun. Kalen walked alone, his footsteps swallowed swiftly by the shifting dunes. The wind carried no songs here, only silence, a silence that wrapped itself around him like a shroud. His lean form was bent slightly against the heat, sun-bleached hair tangled by the breeze, eyes dark pools that reflected both sorrow and hope. He was a bard without a song, a wanderer searching for a purpose in a land where legends slept beneath layers of sand. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the horizon bled into shades of amber and rose, Kalen found himself atop a lonely dune. The sky above spilled stars like spilled ink, vast and mysterious. He settled onto the cool sand, the weight of his lute a familiar comfort in his hands. His fingers moved instinctively over the strings, coaxing a melancholy tune that blended with the whispering winds. The melody was soft, tentative, a lament for a place he couldn't name, a past he barely remembered. Night deepened, and the desert's silence grew profound. Kalen's eyes traced patterns in the stars, seeking answers in constellations that had guided countless travelers before him. Yet, all he found was an echo of loneliness, a yearning that pulled at his soul. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a faint scent of something ancient and forgotten, a fragrance like dust and old bones. Driven by a strange impulse, Kalen rose and began to walk, his bare feet sinking into the cool sand. The wind tugged at his cloak, guiding him toward a low rise where the dunes seemed to gather like silent watchers. There, half buried beneath layers of golden sand, something caught the moonlight, pale and curving, delicate and unervingly familiar. With shaking hands, Kalen brushed away the sand to reveal a flute carved from bone. Its surface was etched with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly, ancient and worn by time, yet alive with a strange energy. The air around it shimmered, as if the desert itself held its breath. As Kalen lifted the flute, a sudden rush of visions assaulted his mind. Flickering images unfolded like a dream, towering figures cloaked in sand and shadow, a storm of melody and power, gods long forgotten, stirring beneath the earth's crust. The sound of a haunting song filled his ears, a melody woven from sorrow and strength, promising both wonder and peril. He staggered back, clutching the flute tightly. The desert wind swirled around him, rising to a whispering chorus. It was as if the sands themselves listened, waiting for the first note to awaken the forgotten. Night deepened further, and Kalen sat once more on the dune, the bone flute resting against his chest. His heart thundered with a mix of fear and awe. What was this instrument? What secrets did it hold? And what song would he dare to play? Above, the stars glimmered, silent witnesses to a moment that would change the course of the desert's endless story. The whispers beneath the dunes had begun, and Kalen was at their center, a solitary bard poised on the edge of a melody that might awaken gods. He closed his eyes, took a breath heavy with the desert's timeless air, and raised the bone flute to his lips. The first note trembled on the wind, fragile, haunting, full of promise and dread. The desert listened. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the endless waves of sand. Kalen sat perched atop a wind-worn dune, the bone flute cradled in his hands as the desert's silence wrapped around him like a cloak. The instrument was cold against his skin, its surface etched with faint, ancient carvings that seemed to pulse softly in the fading light. He lifted it to his lips, hesitating. The desert held its breath. His fingers found the holes, tentative at first, drawing a single trembling note that trembled into the still air. Then another and another, weaving a melody that was both mournful and strangely beautiful. The notes carried on the evening breeze, rippling through the sand, and stirring whispers that seemed to rise from the depths of the desert itself. Kellen's eyes widened as a faint shimmer flickered at the edge of his vision. A translucent figure, barely there, like a reflection on disturbed water. It hovered, silent and sorrowful, before fading into the twilight. The bard's heart quickened. The flute was more than a relic. It was a key unlocking voices long buried beneath the dunes. The following day, Kellen's steps led him to a small village nestled near a cluster of jagged rocks. There, he sought the counsel of old Tarek, a man whose age matched the desert's own ancient bones. The elder's eyes, sharp despite the years, studied the flute with a mixture of reverence and fear. That flute, Tarek began in a voice rough as sandstone, is tied to the gods who once walked these lands. They were not gentle gods, but mighty and wrathful. When they warred, the desert itself wept. Azareth, the shrouded god, was sealed beneath these sands to keep balance. Your flute, it sings with that power. Kalen listened, the weight of the flute's legacy settling heavily on his shoulders. The bard's curiosity was aflame, but with each tale came a shadow of dread. Tarek's stories hinted at dangers that lurked beneath the surface of the desert's beauty-forgotten powers, eager to awaken. As the day wore on, Kalen returned to the solitude of the dunes. The desert seemed different now, alive with unseen eyes and hushed voices. He played the flute again, each note summoning faint echoes whispers that slipped through the sand like ghosts. The melodies teased memories not his own, visions of a war that shook the heavens and cursed the earth. Night fell, and beneath a tapestry of stars, Kellen's flute sang a haunting tune. His mind was flooded with cryptic visions, gods cloaked in shadow, battles that shattered the skies, and the sorrow of a world buried beneath endless sand. The desert held its secrets close, but through the music, Kalen felt the fragile threads of forgotten history, pulling him deeper into a perilous dance with the past. Yet, amid the awe and melancholy, a question lingered in his heart. What price would he pay for awakening these echoes? And what fate awaited the one who dared call upon the gods buried beneath the dunes? The wind shifted, carrying the flute's final note into the vast silence. Kellen's journey had only just begun, and the desert listened, waiting for the melody yet to come. The desert stretched endlessly beneath a sky smeared with the burning hues of sunset, a vast sea of shifting sands that swallowed the horizon whole. Kalen trudged onward, each step sinking softly into the warm grains, the bone flute tucked carefully beneath his worn cloak. The day's heat lingered stubbornly, the last embers of sun casting long shadows across the dunes. He was alone, as always, yet the desert hummed with a strange vitality tonight, as if the very air whispered secrets meant only for those who dared listen. Ahead, a figure appeared, sharp against the glowing horizon. Kalen paused, squinting to make out the silhouette. A woman, her dark skin radiant beneath the fading light, moving with a purposeful grace. His heart, weighed down by years of solitude, stirred with a faint flicker of curiosity. He approached cautiously, mindful of the desert's capricious nature and the dangers that lurked unseen. "You wander far," she said, voice steady and clear, cutting through the stillness like a desert wind. Her eyes were sharp, scanning him with an intensity that made Kalen instinctively lower his gaze. Few come this deep without purpose. Kalen nodded, hesitant. "I seek answers." The woman studied him for a moment longer before offering a faint smile, but it did not reach her eyes. "I am Mira. I know these sands and their secrets. You carry something with you, an old power, one that should sleep beneath the dunes." He glanced down at the bone flute, its surface etched with faded symbols, cold and fragile against his palm. "It found me." Myra's gaze darkened. "That flute is a key, a melody that wakes what should remain silent. The gods buried here long ago are restless, and their shadows stretch farther than you can see. Despite her caution, Mira did not turn away. Instead, she folded her arms, a clear offer of alliance. I will come with you. The desert is no place for a lone wanderer, especially one who stirs the dead. Together they moved forward, the shifting sands swallowing their footprints, as if the desert sought to erase their passage. The air grew cooler with the approaching night, the sky bleeding from orange to deep indigo. Kellen's fingers brushed the flute's carved surface, and a sudden impulse took hold. He raised it to his lips and breathed a soft, tentative note. The sound was fragile, but carried far, a mournful melody that slipped through the dunes like a whispered prayer. Around them, shadows seemed to waver and shiver, fleeting forms flickering at the edges of vision. Myra's hand tightened on the curved dagger at her belt as she scanned the darkness. They come, she murmured, eyes narrowing. Spirits drawn by your song. Not all mean harm, but none are bound by mortal rules. The desert around them whispered and sighed, alive with unseen watchers. Kalen lowered the flute, his breath uneven. I did not mean to call them. Intent matters little, Mira said. The gods' memory is long, and their wrath longer. As they made camp beneath a cluster of jagged rocks, Kalen played again, softer this time, coaxing gentle notes that seemed to soothe the restless apparitions. Spectral figures danced on the fringe of firelight, translucent shapes that flickered like candle flames, their faces etched with sorrow and ancient grief. Kalen felt their stories pressing against his soul, fragments of a time when gods walked openly among mortals. Mira watched silently, her expression unreadable. You carry a heavy burden, she said finally. This is no mere instrument. It is a bridge between worlds, between past and present. The night deepened, and the desert's breath grew colder. The stars overhead blinked down like distant eyes, indifferent to the fragile lives below. Kellen's melody wove through the darkness, a fragile thread of hope and warning, echoing the desert's silence and secrets. As dawn approached, Myra stood, her gaze fixed on the horizon where shadows gathered like storm clouds. We must move. The flute's song stirs more than spirits. Kalen nodded, heart heavy but resolute. Together, they set out, bound by a fragile trust and the unspoken knowledge that the desert's mysteries were far from spent. The shadows on the horizon lengthened, and the dance of melody and sand continued, a haunting prelude to the trials yet to come. The desert held its breath, waiting. Kellen's journey had always been solitary, a wandering soul adrift amidst endless dunes. Yet in Myra's presence, a new rhythm emerged, one tempered by caution, sharpened by knowledge, and bound by a shared fate. As they pressed onward, the desert's silent watchers trailed them, figures half seen, their forms flickering like mirages, caught between worlds. The stories Mira told were woven with threads of warning and reverence. She spoke of sacred sites hidden beneath the sands, places where the veil between the living and the dead thinned to a fragile whisper. Her lineage marked her as a guardian, sworn to protect these sacred grounds from desecration and the wrath of forgotten gods. Kalen listened, the flute's weight a constant presence at his side. Questions churned in his mind. Could he control this power? Was he destined to become a herald of destruction or a guardian of balance? With each note he played, the desert seemed to respond, the sand shifting beneath their feet, the wind carrying echoes of ancient songs long forgotten. One evening, beneath a sky brushed with stars, Kalen found himself playing a melody steeped in melancholy and hope. The air around them thrummed with energy, and spectral figures gathered silently, their translucent forms leaning into the music like moths to a flame. Mira stood watchful, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. They listen, she said quietly, and so do others. Kellen's fingers trembled on the bone flute. Others. There are those who worship the shrouded god, Mira explained, voice low and urgent. They will come for the flute. They hunger for the power you hold. The desert's vast silence felt suddenly fragile. A thin thread stretched taut between the living and the dead. Kaelin met Myra's gaze, a resolve hardening within him. Then we faced them together. A fierce wind rose, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant thunder. Shadows deepened on the horizon, and the desert's ancient song swelled, a melody of warning, of power, and of the fragile hope that even in the vastest loneliness, connection could be found. Their journey was just beginning. The desert had never seemed so alive or so dangerous. The sun, a fierce orb blazing behind a thin veil of heat, had just begun its slow descent when the first winds stirred the sands. Kaelin tightened his cloak around his lean frame, the coarse fabric rough against his weathered skin. His fingers brushed absently over the bone flute at his side, the curious artifact that had become both a burden and a beacon in his solitary journey. The wind grew stronger, a sudden and fierce sandstorm brewing on the horizon with an ominous roar. Kellen's heart quickened as the swirling grains whipped around him, stinging like 1,000 tiny knives. He sought shelter behind a jagged outcrop of sun-baked rock, the air thick with dust and the scent of dry earth. Mira was already at his side, her sharp eyes narrowing against the storm's fury, her hand resting protectively on the curved dagger at her belt. "This storm came too quickly," she said, voice steady but edged with concern. "The desert doesn't stir without reason." Kaelin nodded, his gaze fixed on the bone flute nestled in his palm. Since he had unearthed it beneath the shifting dunes, the instrument had whispered to him in dreams and visions, melodies of a time when gods had ruled over the endless sands. Now, faced with the storm's wrath, he felt an urgent compulsion to play. Raising the flute to his lips, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the desert's breath mingle with his own. The first notes slipped into the storm like a fragile thread, tentative and trembling. But as the melody grew, it wove through the howling winds, a haunting song that seemed to bind the tempest itself. The bone flute's voice was unlike any music Kaelin had ever played, ancient and mournful, carrying the weight of forgotten power. Then, from the swirling sands, ghostly shapes began to coalesce. Pale forms shimmered with a soft, ethereal light, faces marked by sorrow, and stories long buried beneath the desert's shifting dunes. They drifted around Kaelin and Mira, silent witnesses to the melody that stirred their restless souls. Kellen's heart pounded. The spirits were not malevolent, but their presence was overwhelming. Their mournful whispers carried on the storm's roar, spoke of ancient wars, lost gods, and a world where the boundary between life and death was thin and fragile. "Steady, Kaelin," Mira urged, her voice cutting through the chaos. She stepped closer, her dark eyes fierce beneath the storm-darkened sky. "You must control it. Don't let the music slip away." With trembling fingers, Kaelin tempered the melody, weaving a gentler tune that calmed the spirits. One by one, their faces softened, their whispers fading into the wind. The storm began to abate, the sands settling back into silence. But as quiet returned, distant voices echoed through the desert night, whispers of the bone flute's song and the summoner who dared to call forth the dead. Shadows moved beneath the dunes, figures cloaked in secrecy and driven by devotion to a shrouded god. Kaelin exchanged a wary glance with Myra. The desert's fragile balance had been disturbed, and the consequences of their actions were only beginning to reveal themselves. Yet beneath the weight of uncertainty, a strange hope lingered, that through melody, even forgotten power might find a new purpose. As the final notes faded into the twilight, Kaelin knew this was only the beginning. The desert's silence had been broken, and with it, the whispers beneath the dunes stirred to life once more. The desert sun hung high, relentless and scorching, as Kaelin trudged through the shifting dunes beside Myra. The bone flute rested heavily in his satchel, a silent reminder of the power and peril that shadowed their every step. Myra's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, ever watchful, her fingers brushing the curved dagger at her hip. The air shimmered with heat, and the sands whispered secrets that only the wind seemed to understand. As they crested a ridge, a figure emerged like a mirage against the shimmering heat. Tall and lean, his silver hair caught the sun's glare, cascading around his shoulders in a halo of light that contrasted starkly with the faded desert robes draped loosely over his frame. A sly grin played on his lips, and his eyes gleamed with a mixture of amusement and calculation. Kalen slowed, instinct prickling at the back of his neck. "Who goes there?" Mira called, her voice steady but edged with caution. The stranger raised a hand in a casual salute, his grin widening. A friend, perhaps, or something close enough. "I am Elian. Have traveled these sands longer than most dare to remember." Myra's gaze narrowed, fingers tightening around the hilt of her dagger. "We have no need for company, especially from strangers who wander alone." Elian chuckled softly, the sound like dry leaves rustling. "And yet, here I am. Fate or folly. You decide. But before you dismiss me, know this, I possess knowledge that might prove useful." Kalen stepped forward, curiosity overcoming caution. "What knowledge?" "Songs," Elian replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Ancient melodies that speak to the dead, to the gods buried beneath the sands. The flute you carry, it sings a dangerous song. I know its tune, the histories it unlocks, and the cult that thirsts for its voice." Myra exchanged a wary glance with Kalen. "Why should we trust you?" "Trust is a luxury in the desert," Elian said, eyes sparkling with mischief. "But consider me a guide through the shadows that follow you, or an obstacle should you choose to ignore my counsel." That night, beneath a sky smeared with stars, they gathered around a modest fire. Elian produced a small, worn instrument, fingers dancing over its strings to evoke a melody both haunting and hypnotic. The notes rose and fell like desert winds, weaving through the camp with an otherworldly grace. Kalen felt the music wrap around him, stirring memories and emotions long buried. Yet beneath the enchantment lay a subtle unease, a reminder that not all who sing such songs do so with pure intent. Myra watched Elian closely, her protective instincts flaring. "You speak of the cult. What do you know of them?" Elian's expression darkened. "More than I care to admit. I was once among them, before doubt and disillusionment set me free, or perhaps bound me to a different fate. They worship Azareth, the shrouded god, whose wrath sleeps beneath these sands. They seek to awaken him, to reclaim the power lost to time." Kellen's grip tightened on his flute. "And what of you? Are you truly free?" A shadow crossed Elian's face, a flicker of vulnerability masked by his sly grin. "Freedom is a song with many verses. I walk a path between light and shadow, ally and adversary, friend and foe." The tension thrummed in the air like the rising wind. Mira's voice broke the silence, steady yet firm. "If we are to survive what lies ahead, we must understand one another. But trust will be earned, not given." Elian nodded, the flames reflecting in his silver eyes. "Agreed. For now, I will walk with you. But know this, I have secrets that could save you or doom you. Choose your steps wisely." As the fire flickered and the desert night deepened, Kalen contemplated the fragile alliance forming beneath the endless sky. Elian's presence was a riddle wrapped in a melody, an enigma whose true song had yet to be revealed. The bone flute in his pack seemed to hum softly, as if sensing the shifting tides of fate. Tomorrow, the desert would hold new challenges, and the dance of trust and betrayal would begin in earnest. For now, the haunting music of the night carried them forward, a fragile thread binding three souls in a world where gods slept beneath the sand and the past, whispered in forgotten tunes. The journey was no longer theirs alone, and the desert's secrets grew deeper with every step. The desert night was a tapestry of stars, each pinprick of light a distant witness to the stories whispered through the ages. Around a modest fire that flickered against the vast darkness, Kalen sat cross-legged, the bone flute resting on his knees, its pale surface gleaming faintly. Before him, old Tarek's weathered face was illuminated by the flames, his eyes deep wells of memory and sorrow. Long ago, Tarek began, his voice rasping like dry leaves stirred by the wind. The gods walked among us. Their music shaped the world. Their power carved the very dunes beneath our feet. But such power breeds envy and hatred. Azareth, once a god of creation and destruction, sought dominion beyond his right. Kalen listened intently, the flute heavy in his hands, as Tarek's tale unfolded. The ancient war among the gods was a cacophony of clashing melodies and shattering silence. Thunderous chords tore the skies, while desolate harmonies wept across the earth. Azareth's fury was like a storm, consuming all in its path until the other gods, united by desperation, sealed him beneath the desert sands in a prison of silence and shadow. "The flute you carry," Tarek said, nodding toward the bone instrument, "is no mere relic. It is a key, a song that can unbind Azareth's cage. But such a song carries a price." Myra shifted beside Kalen, the firelight tracing the sharp lines of her face. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a piece of cloth, unfolding it carefully to reveal a faded tattoo on her wrist, a symbol carved in intricate patterns resembling swirling desert winds and ancient sigils. "I am of the Guardians," she said quietly, her voice steady but edged with resolve. "My ancestors swore to protect the sacred sites, to keep the balance between the mortal and the divine. The awakening of Azareth threatens more than just this desert. It threatens the fragile peace we all depend on." Kalen glanced at her, seeing the weight of that legacy etched in her dark eyes. He felt the bone flute grow heavier in his grasp, as if it absorbed the mounting gravity of their shared fate. From the shadows beyond the firelight, Elian leaned forward, silver hair shimmering under the moon's gaze. His sly grin was both a reassurance and a warning, and Kellen's gut twisted with uncertainty. Elian's knowledge of ancient songs and arcane magic was undeniable, yet his allegiance remained a shifting mirage. "The desert holds many secrets," Elian mused, voice smooth and enticing. "Some best left undisturbed, others waiting for the right melody to awaken them." Kalen met his gaze, searching for truth, but finding only the shimmer of hidden motives. The tension between trust and suspicion tightened like the desert's relentless heat. As the fire dwindled to embers, Kalen lifted the bone flute to his lips. A soft, melancholic note slipped into the night, weaving through the cool air and stirring the shadows at the edge of the camp. The melody was a lament for forgotten gods, a call to the past and a prayer for the future. In that moment, beneath the silent stars and endless sky, Kalen felt the desert's breath against his skin, a breath heavy with history, power, and peril. The path ahead was uncertain, but the song of the bone flute was clear. The past could not be unlearned, and the delicate balance of the desert depended on those brave enough to face its hidden lore. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Kalen rose, the flute cradled like a fragile promise. Beside him, Mira tightened the straps of her satchel, her gaze steely with purpose. Elian's silhouette lingered a moment longer before fading into the shimmering heat of the waking desert. The desert's ancient secrets were stirring, and the melody of destiny was only beginning to play. Kellen's fingers brushed the bone flute once more, a silent vow forming in his heart. Whatever trials awaited, he would face them with the haunting music of the past echoing in his soul. Outside the village, the sands shifted subtly, as if awakened by the stories told beneath the firelight. Somewhere deep beneath those dunes, the imprisoned gods stirred, his wrath and sorrow waiting to be sung back into the world. And Kalen held the song that could either save or doom them all. The desert was listening. The desert night stretched vast and unyielding, a blanket of ink pierced by countless stars that shimmered like cold embers scattered across the heavens. Kalen perched atop a high dune, the bone flute resting gently between his calloused fingers. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and distant sage, and a soft breeze stirred the worn edges of his tattered cloak. He drew a slow breath and lifted the flute to his lips, the cool bone smooth and familiar against his mouth. As he exhaled, a single haunting note slipped forth, a sound both fragile and resolute, echoing into the silence like a whispered secret. The melody grew, delicate threads of sound weaving through the night air, curling and twisting like tendrils of smoke over the sand. Each note seemed to carry weight memories half remembered, shadows of a life long fragmented. The desert, vast and indifferent, listened as if it had always known this song. Kellen's eyes closed, and the world dissolved into the music. He could feel the ache of solitude pressing against his ribs, the loneliness that had become his constant companion since the village fire that had claimed his family and scattered his past to the winds. Beneath the silent stars, the flute's voice was a tether to something deeper, a bridge between the lost and the living. It sang of ancient sorrows and fragile hope, winding through the echoes of forgotten gods and the dust of time. The melody stirred faint shapes in the distance glimmers of light that flickered like the ghost of a distant dream. Spirits, perhaps, or memories given fleeting form by the music's mournful call. Kellen's hands trembled slightly, the weight of the flute's power pressing heavily upon him. He had felt it grow stronger with each song, a pull toward something vast and unknowable beneath the dunes. The burden was immense, yet the call to understand it was irresistible. From the shadows, a soft rustle of sand announced Mira's arrival. Her presence was steady and grounding, a dark silhouette against the star-streaked sky. She seated herself beside him without a word, offering a silent companionship that spoke volumes. Her sharp eyes met his, steady and understanding in the flickering moonlight. "You carry more than the flute's burden," Myra said softly, her voice a low balm against the vast silence. "Your heart plays a melody all its own." Kalen smiled faintly, a tired gesture that barely touched the sorrow in his gaze. "Sometimes I fear the song will be the last thing I ever play." Myra reached out, her hand brushing against his wrist, a simple touch that anchored him to the present. "You are not alone, Kalen. Even the desert is not endless when shared with another." The two sat beneath the stars, sharing stories and silence alike. Mira spoke of her lineage, of the sacred sites she was sworn to protect, and the heavy price of knowledge. Kalen listened, feeling the threads of their lives intertwine, like the notes of his flute, each voice a vital part of the song. As the night deepened, the music faded to a gentle hum, and the ephemeral figures that had lingered at the edges of vision vanished into the sand's embrace. The desert exhaled, the eternal quiet returning as if to hold its breath. Kalen looked upward, the endless expanse of stars reflecting the turmoil within. His journey was far from over, the path ahead fraught with peril and uncertainty. Yet in that moment, beneath the silent stars, a fragile hope stirred a melody not yet finished, a story still unfolding. He lifted the bone flute once more, fingers poised to play the next note, the desert listening. The music whispered promises, ancient and eternal, carried on the desert wind as dawn crept quietly over the horizon. The night had taught him that even in solitude, connection could be found in shared stories, in the haunting beauty of a melody, and in the steadfast presence of a friend. And so, Kalen played on, weaving the past with the present, the living with the dead, beneath the silent stars that watched over the endless sands. As the first light of morning painted the dunes in hues of gold and rose, The flute's last note lingered in the air, a soft, mournful echo that promised both endings and beginnings. Kaelin knew that the weight of the flute's power would only grow heavier, but so too would the strength he found in companionship and the music that bound them all. And with that, the desert held its breath once more, waiting for the next song to awaken the sands. The desert sun hung merciless and unyielding over the endless dunes, a blazing orb that cast sharp shadows and baked the earth beneath Kellen's weary boots. He squinted against the glare, his fingers brushing the bone flute nestled in his satchel. The weight of the instrument was heavier than mere bone and weathered carvings. It carried the burden of ancient power, a whisper of the gods long buried beneath the sand. Beside him, Mira's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, her hand never far from the curved dagger strapped to her belt. "They're close," she murmured, voice low as the wind stirred grains of sand around their feet. "The cult. I can feel their presence like shadows creeping beneath the sun." Kaelin nodded, heart tightening. The whispers on the wind had become shouts in recent days, rumors carried from village to village of the bone flute's awakening and the return of the shrouded god. The cultists who worshipped Azareth were no longer content to lurk in secrecy. They sought to claim the flute and unleash their god upon the desert once more. They found a narrow cleft between jagged rocks, where the searing heat lessened just enough for a brief respite. The two settled, careful not to disturb the fragile silence that had settled over the land like a shroud. Kaelin drew the flute from his bag, tracing its delicate etchings with reverent fingers. The carvings seemed to shift in the sunlight, revealing faces and symbols that defied time itself. "We can't outrun them," Mira said, eyes narrowing. "We have to face this." Before Kaelin could answer, a soft rustle caught their attention. From the shadows emerged Elyon, his silver hair catching the sunlight like strands of moonlight woven into day. His eyes glittered with a mix of mischief and something darker, a concealed storm beneath his calm exterior. "I see the desert breathes with unrest," Elyon said, his voice smooth as silk but edged with caution. "I come bearing knowledge, though it may not bring comfort." Callan's gaze hardened. Elyon's sudden appearance was both a relief and a warning. The traveler's reputation preceded him, a former priest of Azareth's cult, or so the whispers said. Trust was a luxury Kaelin could ill afford. "Speak," Kaelin commanded, the flute pressing against his palm like a pulse. Elyon's smile faltered, the weight of confession settling over him. Azareth's followers have grown bold. They seek to harness the flute's power to awaken their god. I once walked their path, drawn by promises of power and purpose. But I have seen the cost. Myra's hand tightened around her dagger, eyes sharp. "Why should we believe you?" "Because," Elyon sighed, "I want to stop what I helped set in motion. But my past is a chain I cannot break easily." The desert wind carried distant chants, faint yet unmistakable, an ominous hymn rising like a tide. The cultists were near, their intent clear. Colin's fingers curled around the flute. The choice weighed on him, to play and risk unleashing chaos, or to surrender and lose the chance to protect those he cared for. "We stand at a precipice," he said softly. "The flute is the key, but also the lock. If we fail, the desert will drown in shadows." As the cultists closed in, chanting in a language older than the dunes, Kaelin raised the flute to his lips. The first note was a whisper, a haunting melody that stirred the very air. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the sands trembling as ghostly figures shimmered in the heat haze. The cultists faltered, caught between reverence and terror. Myra sprang into action, blade flashing as she defended Kaelin from the advancing fanatics. Elyon watched, torn between old loyalties and newfound resolve, his eyes flickering with conflict. The moment hung suspended, fragile as a desert flower in bloom. Kellen's music wove through the chaos, a tapestry of sorrow and defiance, calling forth the restless spirits of the desert's forgotten past. The battle lines were drawn, not just between mortal foes, but between the echoes of ancient wrath and the fragile hope of redemption. Callan's heart pounded, the weight of the flute heavier than ever. Trust was a scarce commodity, and the desert's silence had been broken. The awakening was underway, and with it, the promise of a reckoning that would shape the fate of all beneath the eternal sun. As the melody swelled, a sudden gust swept across the dunes, carrying with it a whispering promise and a chilling warning. The cultists retreated for now, but their eyes burned with fanatic resolve. Elian stepped closer, his voice a low murmur. "This is only the beginning." Callan met his gaze, uncertainty and resolve entwined. The path ahead was shrouded in sand and shadow, but the bone flute's song would be their guide, whether to salvation or ruin. And somewhere beneath the shifting dunes, Azereth stirred. The sun dipped lower as the desert's heat softened into a golden haze. Callan, Mira, and Elian found a momentary sanctuary beneath a rocky outcrop. The air was thick with dust and tension, the silence punctuated by the distant calls of desert birds and the whisper of the wind. "We can't keep running," Mira said, her voice steady despite the weariness etched into her features. "The cult's numbers grow. They will come again, stronger and more desperate." Elian nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon where shadows lengthened. "I will aid you, but know this my past may haunt us. The cult is not so easily shaken." Callan looked at the bone flute resting on his lap, the carvings glowing faintly in the twilight. "And we must be ready. The desert is listening." As night fell, the desert's secrets deepened, and the cult of the shrouded god prepared to reclaim what was lost. The battle for the flute and the soul of the desert had only just begun. Callan's fingers tightened around the bone flute. The desert around him seemed to pulse with ancient energy, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down from the dunes. The cultists' chanting grew louder, a chorus of shadows seeking to drown the melody of life. He glanced at Mira, whose dark eyes burned with fierce determination, and then at Elian, whose silver hair caught the moonlight like a blade's edge, beautiful, dangerous, uncertain. The choice was his alone, and the desert awaited his song. The desert sun hung low, casting a golden haze over the endless sea of sand dunes that stretched beyond the horizon. Callan felt the weight of the bone flute heavy in his satchel, its presence a constant reminder of the unseen forces stirring beneath the desert's surface. Beside him, Myra moved with practiced ease, her sharp eyes scanning the shifting landscape as if reading a language only she could understand. "The place is near," Mira said, voice low and steady, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of reverence. "My ancestors swore an oath to guard it, to keep it hidden from those who would seek to unravel its secrets." Callan nodded, feeling a mix of curiosity and caution. The desert was a keeper of memories, but some memories were better left buried. Yet here they were, drawn inexorably toward a place that promised answers, or perhaps new dangers. Their footsteps stirred the fine sand as they approached a cluster of ancient stones half buried beneath the dunes. The entrance to the sacred site yawned before them, framed by crumbling pillars etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with forgotten magic. Callan's heart quickened. The air here was different, cooler, heavier with the scent of earth and dust, of time itself preserved. Mira stepped forward, her fingers brushing over a weathered carving depicting intertwined serpents and celestial bodies. "These markings tell of the war among gods," she explained, her voice a whisper. "A war that shattered the heavens and buried Azereth beneath these sands. Our people became guardians, watchers over what remains." Callan studied the symbols, feeling the pull of ancient power radiating from the stones. He carefully retrieved the bone flute, its surface cold and smooth against his fingers. Tentatively, he raised it to his lips and played a soft, haunting melody, a tune woven from threads of sorrow and hope. The notes echoed through the ruins, stirring something unseen. A faint shimmer rose along the walls, spectral echoes flickering like mirages in the fading light. The sand outside swirled gently, whispering secrets lost to time. Myra's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, dark and alert. Suddenly, a tremor rippled through the ground, causing dust to cascade from the cracked ceiling. She drew her curved dagger with a swift motion, voice low and urgent. The cultists grow bolder. They are close, seeking to desecrate this place and unleash what should remain silent. Kellen's gaze hardened. The flute's power was a double-edged sword, capable of awakening both wonder and ruin. As the desert's ancient memories stirred, so too did the shadows that coveted them. Together, they prepared to face whatever came next, guardians of a buried past whose echoes might yet shape the desert's future. The wind rose again, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a melody yet to be played, a song that would decide the fate of gods and men alike. But beneath the shifting sands, deeper secrets waited, silent and watchful, as the desert held its breath. The desert air hung heavy, thick with the fading light of day, and the promise of night's cool embrace. Kalen sat cross-legged upon a ridge of sand, the bone flute resting lightly in his hands, its smooth surface cool against his fingers, despite the lingering heat of the sun. Nearby, Elian lounged with a careless grace, his silver hair catching the dying light, casting a faint halo around his head. The traveler's eyes gleamed with that ever-present slyness, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips, as if he held secrets meant only for himself. "You play well," Elian said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like a taut wire. "But you have no idea what this flute truly can do." Kellen's gaze lifted, meeting the traveler's confident stare. "And you do." "Perhaps," Elian replied, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The melodies you coax from those bones are but the surface of a deeper song, a song that can bend the will of gods and mortals alike." The desert wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of sage and sand. Kellen's fingers tightened around the flute. "I seek to understand its power, not to wield it for destruction." Elian's grin widened, shadows flickering across his face. "Ah, but power is never so easily contained. To know is to desire. To desire is to risk." With a smooth motion, Elian reached into his robes and drew out a slender reed flute, worn and weathered by time. He lifted it to his lips and began to play. The notes were unlike anything Kalen had ever heard, a weaving of sorrow and seduction, a melody that stirred the very soul of the desert. The sands seemed to shift in rhythm, the air thick with a palpable magic. Kalen closed his eyes, the music wrapping around him like a velvet cloak. Images flickered behind his eyelids, ancient ceremonies beneath starlit skies, gods walking among mortals, the bone flute raised high as a key to forgotten power. The visions were intoxicating, a promise of knowledge and strength beyond his wildest dreams. When Elian's playing ceased, the silence was almost deafening. "You see," Elian murmured, his voice a honeyed temptation, "with this flute, you could reshape the desert's fate. No longer a lost wanderer, but a master of forgotten powers." Kalen opened his eyes, the weight of the traveler's words pressing down upon him. "And at what cost?" Before Elian could reply, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "At too great a cost, if you ask me." Mayra emerged from the shadows, her dark eyes flashing with fierce determination. Her hand rested on the curved dagger at her waist, and the satchel of herbs swung gently at her side. "You don't know what you're playing with, Elian. The cult's promises are lies wrapped in poison." Elian's smile faltered for a moment, but his charm quickly returned. "And yet, Myra, it is you who clings to old fears, while Kalen stands on the edge of something new." Myra's gaze hardened. "New or not, the desert's balance is fragile. The power you tempt him with could bring ruin to us all." Kalen felt torn between the two forces pulling at him, Elian's seductive allure and Myra's grounding wisdom. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, the wind whispering secrets just beyond reach. "I need to know," Kalen said finally, his voice low but resolute. "Not just the power, but the truth." Elian stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then follow me. There are places where the past still sings, where the flute's secrets lie buried. But beware, once you hear the deeper song, there's no turning back." Myra's eyes flashed warning, but she said nothing, knowing the choice belonged to Kalen. As night fell, the trio set out beneath the stars, the desert's vastness stretching endlessly around them. Elian's melody lingered in Kalen's mind, a siren call that promised both illumination and peril. Hours later, at a hidden oasis shielded by jagged rocks, Elian revealed faded carvings etched into ancient stone. "These markings tell of the flute's origin," he explained, tracing the grooves with a finger. "A relic forged in a war between gods, a key to awakening power long forgotten." Kalen studied the symbols, feeling the weight of history pressing down. "And the cult. They seek to use that power to bring Azrith back," Elian said quietly, "to restore what was lost. But at what price?" Mira stepped forward, her voice firm. "A price too high. We must stop them." Elian's eyes flickered, a hint of conflict beneath his polished exterior. Perhaps the desert needs a new guardian, one who can wield the flute's power without fear. Kalen's heart pounded. The choice before him was no longer just about survival. It was about destiny. Could he embrace such power without losing himself? Or would the desert's ancient wrath consume him? The night deepened, shadows lengthening like fingers reaching for the soul. Kalen lifted the bone flute to his lips once more, the notes flowing from him. A delicate balance of hope and warning, a song that echoed across the sands, inviting the dawn. But beneath the melody, a question lingered. Which path would he choose when the desert demanded its answer? The desert wind carried his song far and wide, a melody of temptation and resolve, and the night listened with bated breath. The desert twilight stretched long and low, painting the sands in hues of molten gold and bruised purple, as Kalen lifted the bone flute to his lips. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and distant rain, though no cloud marred the endless sky. His fingers trembled slightly, the weight of the instrument, both physical and spiritual. Around him, the dunes whispered in the wind, as if waiting with bated breath for the melody to come. With a slow, deliberate breath, Kalen began to play. The notes poured forth, hollow and haunting, weaving into the silence like a thread of silver through black velvet. The melody rose and fell, carrying the melancholy of forgotten years, the sorrow of lives long past, and the fragile hope of those still tethered to the living world. As the music seeped into the sands, the desert seemed to respond, a subtle shiver in the air, a soft susurration that grew into voices. At first, they were faint, like distant echoes on the wind. Then, gradually, ghostly forms emerged from the haze of heat and dust, flickering and wavering like candle flames caught in a breeze. These were spirits unlike those Kalen had summoned before, deeper, older, more potent. Their faces bore the marks of ancient grief and wrath, their eyes reflecting the endless desert night. Mira stood close by, her dark eyes sharp and alert, every muscle coiled like a spring. She held her curved dagger ready, the leather of her satchel rustling softly as she shifted stance. "Kalen," she said quietly, voice taut with urgency, "these are no mere echoes. They carry the weight of old wounds, things best left to rest." Kalen nodded, his fingers pausing on the flute, but the spirits pressed closer, drawn by the music and the power it unleashed. One spirit, tall and regal, stepped forward. His form was translucent, yet his presence commanded the space like a king of old. His voice whispered in a language Kalen did not know, yet somehow understood, a lament of betrayal, a call for reckoning. Elyon leaned against a nearby dune, silver hair catching the last light, his grin enigmatic and unreadable. "They grow restless," he murmured, eyes glittering with something unreadable. Power such as this always comes at a price. Kellen's heart pounded, torn between awe at the beauty of the spirits and dread at their sorrowful wrath. He felt the weight of responsibility settle heavy upon him. The flute was no mere instrument. It was a key to a realm best left undisturbed. "We must be cautious," Myra urged, stepping protectively closer. "The desert does not forgive lightly." As the melody faltered and the last note lingered in the cooling air, the spirits began to waver, their forms dissolving back into the sands from which they had arisen. The desert fell into a pregnant silence, thick with unspoken warnings. Kalen lowered the flute, his gaze distant. "What have I unleashed?" he whispered, the question heavy with the burden of consequences yet to unfold. Elyon's grin faded, replaced by a shadow of seriousness. "The desert holds many secrets, Bard, and some voices are harder to silence than others." The night deepened around them, stars gleaming cold and distant. The desert had spoken, and in its voice echoed not only the dead, but the fragile thread that bound past and present, and the perilous path Kalen now walked. The melody of the bone flute had opened doors, and whether those doors led to salvation or ruin remained a question only time could answer. In the stillness, Kalen felt the eyes of the desert upon him, ancient and patient, waiting for the next note, the next step, the next choice that would shape all their fates. He tightened his grip on the flute, a silent vow stirring in his chest to master this power, to protect what remained, and to face whatever shadows the desert yet concealed. The voices from the deep had spoken. Now Kellen's song must continue, but at what cost? And as the wind swirled once more, carrying the faintest echo of a melody long forgotten, the desert held its breath, waiting for the story yet to be told. The desert was restless. It whispered warnings beneath the rising wind, a sound not unlike the distant echo of a flute's melancholy song. Kalen sat atop a ridge, the bone flute cradled in his hands, its ancient carvings cold against his weathered fingers. Above him, the sky darkened with an unnatural heaviness, clouds roiling like a storm brewing beyond the horizon. The sun was a fading ember swallowed by the encroaching dusk, and the wind carried with it the scent of dust and danger. Myra stood nearby, her sharp eyes scanning the shifting sands below. The flicker of a distant fire caught her attention, and she motioned silently to Kalen. "They gather," she said, her voice low but edged with urgency. "The cultists. Their numbers grow every night." Kalen nodded, a tight knot forming in his chest. The bone flute felt heavier now, burdened not just with its own power, but the knowledge of what its melodies might summon. He lifted it to his lips, and the first notes slipped into the wind, a slow, haunting melody that seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of the desert air. Elyon appeared from the shadows, his silver hair catching the last light of day. He smiled that sly, enigmatic grin, but there was no warmth in it tonight. "You play as if the desert itself might listen," he remarked, voice low and cautious. "Perhaps it does," Kalen replied. "Or perhaps it's the gods beneath the sands who hear." The three of them settled into a tense vigil, the desert around them alive with unseen movement. The cultists' encampment lay hidden in a ravine, a flickering constellation of torchlight, and chanting voices that rose and fell like the breath of some slumbering beast. Their songs were a twisted mirror of Kellen's own melodies, dark, fervent, and filled with a desperate hunger. Myra tightened her grip on the curved dagger at her side. "They believe Azrith will return to them," she said quietly, "to restore the desert's forgotten power. But the cost will be ruin." Elyon's gaze flickered toward the horizon, where the first rumble of thunder rolled across the dunes. Power, he mused, is a tempting thing, even for those who fear it. Kellen's fingers danced across the flute, coaxing a melody that was both warning and plea. The notes were fragile threads stretched across the growing storm, seeking to hold back the tide of chaos. Each breath he took seemed to draw deeper into the desert's ancient memory, a place where gods had once walked and men had dared to challenge fate. The wind rose sharply, carrying with it the scent of sand and smoke. From the encampment came a sudden chorus of cries, a surge of fervor that sent ripples through the night. Shadows moved like living things, and the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their feet. "They're coming," Mira whispered, eyes narrowing. Elian's hand fell to the small dagger at his belt, his expression somber. "Then we must be ready." As the first drops of rain fell, cold and surprising in the desert's heat, Kellen's melody swelled, a desperate harmony that sought to bind the restless spirits and hold the darkness at bay. The flute's voice was a fragile beacon in the gathering storm, a fragile hope amidst the gathering shadows. The desert held its breath, and the storm broke. The night was alive with the clash of wills. Cultists surged forward, chanting Azrith's name in a fervent chorus beneath the thunderous sky. Torches flared like dying stars, casting grotesque shadows upon the swirling sands. Mira moved like a shadow herself, her dagger flashing in the firelight as she defended Kalen, who continued to pour his soul into the bone flute. Elian fought beside them, his magic flickering like sparks against the encroaching darkness. Yet his eyes betrayed the struggle within, torn between allegiance and doubt. The desert was a battlefield, the very air thick with the scent of ozone and ancient power awakening. The ground beneath their feet trembled, as if the buried gods themselves stirred in response to the music and the madness. Kellen's hands ached, the flute's notes rising to a crescendo that shook the night. The wind howled in answer, carrying the melody across the dunes and into the hearts of those who would listen, or be consumed. In the distance, a figure cloaked in shifting shadows and sand rose slowly, eyes burning like embers in the storm. Azrith, the shrouded god, was awakening. Kellen's breath caught. The melody faltered, a fragile thread trembling on the edge of silence. "Hold fast," Mira urged, her voice fierce amid the chaos. "We stand at the brink." Elian's glance met Kellen's, a silent promise or a warning, a line between friend and foe thinner than ever before. And as the storm reached its crescendo, the desert's fragile balance teetered on the edge of oblivion. Kellen's music was all that stood between salvation and ruin. The gathering storm had come. The desert night was restless, the air thick with the scent of dry earth, and the faint trace of jasmine that drifted from some unseen bloom. Kalen sat atop a weathered dune, the bone flute cradled in his hands like a fragile relic of a time long past. His fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of the choice that pressed against his chest like an invisible hand. Around him, the desert seemed to hold its breath, the stars overhead winking like distant eyes watching his every move. He lifted the flute to his lips and exhaled a breath that carried not just air, but the hopes and fears of 1,000 forgotten souls. The first note was low and mournful, a sound that seemed to seep into the sand beneath him, stirring shadows that flickered like candle flames in the periphery of his vision. The melody rose and fell, a lament for the dead and a plea for the living, weaving threads of sound that fluttered through the cool night air. From the darkness came a rustle, and Mira stepped forward, her presence as steady and unyielding as the desert itself. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, caught the dim light of the moon as she approached. "Kalen," she said quietly but firmly, "this power is not meant to be wielded lightly. You summon forces that do not forget, and they do not forgive." He lowered the flute, meeting her gaze. "I know," he admitted, "but the flute calls to me. It sings of things I do not yet understand." Mira shook her head, the dark strands of her hair catching the wind like a banner. "Understanding is not always enough. Sometimes, the right choice is the hardest one to make. Before Kalen could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows beyond the firelight. Elian's silver hair shimmered in the moonlight, and his sly grin faltered as he studied the two. "Hard choices indeed," he murmured, stepping closer. "Choices that define us, and choices that bind us to fates greater than ourselves." Kalen's eyes narrowed. "Why do you follow us, Elian? What is it you truly want?" The traveler's smile wavered, revealing a glimpse of vulnerability beneath his enigmatic exterior. "I am tied to the past you seek to awaken more than you realize," he confessed. "Azrith's cult was once my own, and his cause my burden. But I'm no longer certain where my loyalties lie." Mira's hand rested on the hilt of her dagger, her voice cold. "Then choose, Elian. Stand with us or against us. The desert cannot bear another betrayal." For a moment, silence fell like a shroud. Elian looked away toward the rising moon, then back at Kalen with eyes full of conflicted longing. "I want to believe in a future where the past's shadows do not consume us all," he said softly. "But the road to that future is paved with sacrifice." Kalen's heart pounded as the weight of responsibility pressed down upon him. The flute felt heavy in his hands, a conduit of power that could either protect or destroy. He thought of the spirits he had summoned, the gods he had stirred from their slumber, and the fragile lives caught in the balance. "I cannot let this power fall into the wrong hands," Kalen said at last, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "But I also cannot wield it without risking everything we hold dear." Myra stepped closer, her eyes softening. "Then you must silence the flute, Kalen. Bury it where no one can find it, and let the desert keep its secrets." Elian nodded slowly, the lines of his face etched with regret. "Perhaps that is the only path left to us." As the first light of dawn painted the horizon in hues of gold and rose, Kalen rose to his feet. The desert stretched out before him, vast and eternal, a living tapestry of memories and mysteries. With a final lingering glance at the boned flute, he prepared to make a choice that would echo through the sands for generations to come. The crossroads of destiny lay before him, and there was no turning back. Kalen sat cross-legged on the cool sand, the boned flute resting in his lap like a sleeping serpent. The desert night was alive with distant calls of unseen creatures and the soft whisper of wind across the dunes. His mind churned, tangled in a web of doubt and determination. The flute was a key, a beacon that had awakened long-buried gods and restless spirits. But it was also a curse, a siren's call that threatened to engulf the world in chaos. Myra's footsteps approached, steady and sure. She settled beside him, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "You play as if the desert itself listens," she said quietly. "Perhaps it does," Kalen replied. "Or perhaps it waits for the moment when silence is the only song left." She sighed, her fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I have seen what happens when forgotten powers are disturbed. The desert remembers its wrath, and it does not forget those who awaken it." Kalen's gaze dropped to the flute, the intricate carvings worn smooth by time. "Every melody I play feels like a thread pulling me deeper into a story I barely understand." "Then it is time to write the ending," Mira said firmly, "before the story consumes us all." A shadow moved at the edge of the firelight, and Elian stepped forward, his silver hair a stark contrast to the night. "Endings are rarely simple," he said, voice smooth and measured. "Sometimes they come wrapped in betrayals and broken promises." Kalen looked up, meeting Elian's gaze. "Then tell me, Elian, where do your loyalties truly lie?" The traveler hesitated, a flicker of pain crossing his features. "With the desert," he confessed, "and with the hope that this power can be wielded without destruction. But I fear the path is narrow, and the cost high." "Trust is a fragile thing," Mira said, her tone sharp. "And betrayal is a blade that cuts deepest when least expected." Kalen nodded, the weight of their words settling like dust on his shoulders. The desert's fate rested on his next move, and the line between salvation and ruin was thinner than a whisper. He raised the bone flute to his lips once more, the melody rising like a prayer to the silent stars. The spirits stirred, the desert held its breath, and the crossroads of destiny awaited his choice. The desert horizon began to twist and darken, the sun's golden light swallowed by a swelling tempest that rose like a living thing. At first, the sandstorm was an ominous whisper, a low moan carried on the wind. But it grew quickly, swelling into a furious roar. The air thickened with dust and shadow, the grains whipping like 1,000 invisible hands, clawing and twisting the very fabric of the desert's stillness. Kalen stood rooted atop a high dune, his eyes narrowing against the biting gusts. The bone flute hung heavy in his hands, its smooth ivory surface dulled by the swirling sands. He could feel it thrumming with a power beyond mortal reckoning, a force he had barely begun to understand. And now, as the storm coalesced into a monstrous tempest, the flute's voice seemed to call out in resonance with the desert's rising fury. From the heart of the maelstrom, a shape began to take form. Shadows thickened and deepened, twisting into a towering figure. Azrith, the shrouded god, was awakening. His vast silhouette, cloaked in shifting sands and ephemeral darkness, rose like a colossus against the storm-torn sky. His eyes, twin embers of burning wrath, pierced through the swirling dust, casting an eerie glow that set the dunes ablaze with flickering light. Kellen's breath caught in his throat as he grasped the enormity of what he faced. The god's presence was overwhelming, not merely a force of destruction, but a living memory of betrayal and sorrow, ancient and raw. The desert itself seemed to tremble beneath Azrith's awakening, the earth quaking with the weight of forgotten wrath. Behind Kalen, a swift movement caught his attention. Mira emerged from the shadows of a nearby ridge, her dark skin gleaming with sweat and grit. Her sharp eyes scanned the storm as she tightened her grip on the curved dagger at her side. Years of desert guardianship had honed her senses. She knew the stakes of this day better than anyone. Beside Kalen, she was a steady presence, a fierce protector in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. Kalen, she called over the howling wind, her voice steady despite the tempest. We cannot hold back now. The desert demands a reckoning. He nodded, swallowing the lump of fear rising in his chest. The flute was no longer just an instrument. It was a key to powers beyond human reckoning, a conduit for ancient gods who had slumbered beneath the sands for millennia. And now, Azrith had risen, drawn forth by the melodies Kalen had dared to play. From the jagged rocks to their left, a slender figure watched silently. Elyon, with his silver hair tousled by the storm, leaned against the jagged outcrop. His sly grin had faded, replaced by a grave expression that betrayed the turmoil within. Once a priest of the cult that worshipped Azrith, his loyalties now wavered in the face of the god's terrifying return. Kellen's gaze met Elyon's, searching for some flicker of certainty, but found only shadows and doubt. The desert was a place of shifting sands and shifting hearts, and Elyon embodied that uncertainty better than anyone. The ground trembled beneath them as Azrith's voice, a deep, resonant rumble like the grinding of 1,000 stones, broke through the storm. Who dares awaken me from my slumber? The words echoed across the dunes, carrying the weight of ages. Who calls upon the forgotten wrath that lies buried beneath the sands? Kalen stepped forward, the bone flute raised despite the trembling of his hands. I am Kalen, he said, voice clear against the chaos. A seeker of truth, a bearer of melody. I did not seek to wake you for destruction, but to understand the power you hold and to protect the desert and its people. Azrith's ember eyes narrowed, the shadows around him swirling with violent intent. Your music has stirred the dead and broken the seals that held me captive. For that, the desert will pay a heavy price. The sandstorm intensified, blinding gusts ripping at their clothing and skin. The desert seemed to pulse with the gods' fury, dunes shifting as if alive, swallowing everything in their path. Kalen felt the power of the flute responding, his melodies no longer his own, but threads woven into the gods' ancient wrath. Myra moved to Kellen's side, her dagger glinting as she whispered, "We must hold fast. The desert depends on us." Elian stepped forward reluctantly, raising a hand that shimmered faintly with magic. "Kalen, there is a way to temper his fury. The old songs, the forgotten rites. But it will require sacrifice and unity." Kellen's heart pounded as he faced the impossible. The god's storm was a force of destruction and sorrow, a living testament to the consequences of forgotten power. Yet beneath that rage lay a fractured soul, a deity betrayed and buried by time. The desert held its breath as Kalen raised the bone flute once more, his fingers trembling over the carved holes. The first notes escaped, haunting and low, weaving through the storm like a fragile thread of hope. The melody was sorrowful and fierce, a desperate plea that reached into the god's heart and the desert's soul alike. Azrith faltered, the storm's fury wavering as the music seeped into the shadows. The embers in his eyes flickered, reflecting the haunting beauty of Kellen's song. But the desert was still trembling, caught between the forces of wrath and the fragile hope of harmony. Kellen's voice rose, silent beneath the wind, but felt in the core of the earth as he played the melody that might save or doom them all. The battle for the desert's fate had begun, a dance of gods and mortals, music and sand, power and sacrifice. And as the storm raged, the desert listened, holding its secrets close beneath the endless waves of sand, waiting for the melody that would decide its future. The desert night was alive with a tempest unlike any the sands had known for centuries. Above the swirling dunes, the sky was a roiling canvas of dark clouds and restless stars, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from the storm of power gathering beneath them. At the summit of a jagged dune, Kalen stood, the bone flute pressed firmly to his lips. His lean fingers danced over the carved holes with practiced grace, coaxing from the ancient instrument a melody both haunting and fierce, a song wrought from the very marrow of the desert's forgotten heart. The notes poured forth like liquid shadow and shimmering light, rippling through the air, weaving a tapestry of sound that seemed to breathe life into the barren wasteland. Each haunting phrase stirred the sands below, summoning echoes of a time when gods walked freely among mortals, their power an unbroken current beneath the earth. Kellen's eyes, reflecting both sorrow and hope, remained fixed on the horizon, where the air trembled with the approach of a colossal presence. Mira moved like a shadow among shadows. Her dark skin glistened with the sweat of exertion, and her sharp eyes burned with fierce determination. Clad in the dust-streaked garb of desert guardians, she wielded her curved dagger with a fluidity born of years navigating the treacherous dunes. As spectral tendrils of shadow and sand swirled around her, she intercepted each with swift, precise strikes, her movements a dance of lethal grace. Her satchel of herbs bounced against her side, a reminder of the ancient remedies and protective charms she carried, tools as vital as her blade in this battle of gods and men. The very ground beneath them quaked as Azrith, the shrouded god, emerged from the heart of the desert. His towering form was cloaked in shifting shadows that writhed like living smoke, interlaced with grains of sand that sparkled like tiny stars caught in a void. His eyes burned like embers, fierce and unrelenting, a gaze that spoke of wrath and sorrow, forged over millennia of imprisonment and betrayal. With each step, the desert trembled, the air thickening with the weight of forgotten power. Azrith's voice, a deep rumble echoing like thunder, broke through the howling wind. "You dare summon me, mortal. This land is mine, as it was before your kind walked beneath the sun. Surrender the flute and begone, or be consumed by the storm you have wrought." Kellen's fingers faltered momentarily on the flute, but his resolve hardened. I seek not to command you, Azrath, but to protect this desert and its people. Your time beneath the sands must end, but not through destruction. The balance must be preserved. A gust of sand and shadow lashed out, and Mira stepped forward, intercepting the attack with her dagger, sparks of magic flaring where steel met ethereal force. The desert became a stage for a battle beyond mortal comprehension, a dance of melody and magic, where every note and every strike carried the weight of history. From the swirling chaos emerged Elian, his silver hair catching the ghostly light, his sly grin replaced by a mask of solemn intent. For a moment, the desert held its breath as he cast a surge of magic, a shimmering wave that disrupted the cultists rallying behind Azrath. His allegiance, once ambiguous, became clear as he turned against those who sought to unleash the god's wrath. You've chosen your side, Elian, Kalen called out between notes, the music weaving stronger and more resolute. Elian nodded, his eyes shadowed with conflict. For now, the desert's fate matters more than old loyalties. Together, the trio's combined efforts began to turn the tide. Kellen's flute sang of ancient harmony, echoing the desert's own heartbeat. Myra's blade carved a path through the shadows, a beacon of protection and strength. Elian's magic wove a barrier against the dark forces, striving to tip the balance toward chaos. The night air thrummed with tension, the desert alive with the clash of immortal power and mortal will. Each breath, each note, each movement was a thread in the fragile fabric holding the world together. In this dance of power, Kalen felt the weight of legacy settle heavier upon his shoulders, yet also a flicker of hope born from the unlikeliest of alliances and the enduring strength of melody. As the battle reached its crescendo, the desert winds carried the flute's song far and wide, a haunting call that promised both reckoning and redemption. The fate of the desert hung in the balance, and the dance of power played on, relentless and eternal. The desert wind howled like a living beast, whipping the sands into furious spirals that blinded and battered the combatants alike. Amidst this maelstrom of dust and shadow, Kalen stood like a lone sentinel, the bone flute pressed firmly to his lips. Each breath he drew was steady despite the chaos around him. Each note released a thread weaving through the tempest, a fragile bridge between worlds. The melody spilled forth, a haunting, sorrowful tune that carried the weight of forgotten ages and the faint spark of hope that refused to die. Around him, the air shimmered and rippled, as if the desert itself paused to listen. Slowly, from the shifting sands, ghostly figures emerged, translucent, flickering shapes of warriors long fallen, their eyes vacant yet urgent. Their spectral forms were ethereal and fragmented, like shards of memory given fleeting life. Some bore the scars of ancient battles, others the peaceful countenance of those lost to time's embrace. They drifted in a swirling chorus, their voices lifting in mournful harmonies that entwined with Kellen's flute. The music was a tapestry of longing and lament, a chorus of the fallen that both bolstered the living and unsettled the fragile minds caught amidst the storm. Myra moved through the chaos with a grace born of years spent navigating the desert's cruel embrace. Her dark eyes were sharp and focused, scanning every shadow for threats. Her curved dagger flashed in the dim light as she intercepted a shadow-driven assailant, her movements fluid and precise. The spirit's presence disturbed more than just the battlefield. Some combatants were driven to madness by the spectral voices, their minds fraying under the weight of memories not their own. Myra's steady hand and fierce resolve became the anchor that kept Kalen grounded, a reminder that even in the face of ancient power, human determination could carve a path forward. Elian lingered at the edges, his silver hair catching the scant light as his sly grin flickered with uncertainty. His hands moved in subtle gestures, weaving minor enchantments that wove with Kalen's melody, enhancing the flute's call and protecting their fragile band. Yet beneath his charm lay a turbulent heart, torn between loyalty and temptation. The desert wind carried whispered secrets, fragments of his past as a priest of Azrith's cult, and the dark promises that still tugged at his soul. His presence added tension to the already volatile gathering, a reminder that the lines between friend and foe were as shifting as the sands themselves. Kellen's gaze swept over the battlefield, the flickering spirits, the desperate faces of those fighting for survival, and the looming shadow of Azrith's power pressing ever closer. The flute's song was a double-edged blade. It summoned aid, but also chaos. The spirits lent strength to their cause, but their unrest stirred madness and fear. The bard felt the weight of legacy pressing down upon him, the burden of wielding a power that could awaken gods and shatter worlds. Suddenly, a wail rose above the sandstorm. A spirit, lost to madness, lunged towards Kalen. Mira intercepted with a swift strike, the dagger flashing like lightning as it cut through the spectral form, which dissolved into a mist of sorrowful whispers. Kellen's fingers faltered for a heartbeat, the flute's melody wavering, but he forced himself to breathe deep and continue. His music wove a protective web that held the madness at bay, a lullaby for the restless dead and a beacon for the living. The spirits' voices rose in a crescendo, a haunting chorus that seemed to echo through the very bones of the desert. Kellen's music intertwined with theirs, threading through the sorrow and hope, binding the past and present in a fragile harmony. In that moment, he glimpsed the true cost of forgotten power, the lives lost, the promises broken, and the endless cycle of awakening and silence. As the battle reached its fevered pitch, Elian stepped forward, his voice joining the spectral chorus with a chant both ancient and cryptic. The desert air shimmered with magic, the spirits' forms solidifying briefly into warriors of light and shadow. They surged forward, turning the tide against the encroaching shadows sent by Azrith. Mira fought fiercely beside Kalen, her blade a silver streak against the dark, her eyes shining with unyielding determination. Yet beneath the victory lay an uneasy truth. The spirits, though allies, were restless, fragments of a past too heavy to bear. Kalen knew that the flute's power was not a gift, but a weight that could crush the soul. Each note he played drew him deeper into the desert's ancient memory, threatening to consume the part of him that remained free. As the final echoes of the melody faded into the restless wind, Kalen lowered the flute. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this battle was but a single verse in an endless song. The desert held its secrets close, but the echoes of the fallen would not be silenced so easily. Somewhere beyond the shifting dunes, Azrith's shadow loomed, waiting for the next note to fall. Kellen's eyes met Myra's. A silent promise passed between them. The fight was far from over, and the melody of the desert was far from complete. With a steadying breath, Kalen lifted the bone flute once more, ready to play the next haunting tune. The desert listened. The desert was a living canvas of twilight hues, shadows stretching long across the sands, like fingers reaching for secrets buried deep beneath the dunes. Kalen sat quietly, the bone flute resting lightly against his lips, the haunting melody weaving through the air like a fragile thread binding past and present. Around him, the restless spirits stirred, their mournful whispers, a chorus that echoed the turmoil knotting his heart. Elian stood apart, his silver hair catching the dying light as he gazed toward the horizon where the first stars began to blink awake. The traveler's eyes shimmered with a storm of conflicting loyalties. Beneath the surface of his sly grin lay a battle far fiercer than any desert sandstorm, one that raged inside his soul. He had walked a razor's edge between aiding Kalen and succumbing to the cult of Azrith. Now, the weight of that choice bore down with crushing inevitability. Myra's voice broke the fragile silence. "We can't afford hesitation," she said, her tone steady but edged with the sharp resolve of her ancestors. The desert won't wait for us to decide. Azrith's shadow grows longer every moment. Kalen lowered the flute, his eyes meeting hers. I know, but trusting Elian has cost us dearly. How can I be sure where his true allegiance lies? Myra's gaze hardened. We must face that question and the desert's fate together. As the night deepened, the trio gathered at the edge of a sacred site Myra had sworn to protect. The ruins whispered of forgotten wars and the god who had been buried beneath the sands. Kellen's fingers trembled as he lifted the bone flute once more, the notes spilling forth like fragile threads of hope and despair entwined. Suddenly, a sharp cry shattered the stillness. Elian's shadow darted through the camp, a blade glinting with cruel intent. Betrayal erupted like lightning across the sky. Kalen barely had time to react before Elian's dagger flashed toward Myra. The desert air was rent with tension, the fragile alliance fracturing as swiftly as the shifting dunes. Elian, why? Kalen demanded, breath ragged with shock and disbelief. The traveler's eyes flickered with pain and regret. I had no choice, he whispered, voice choked with the weight of impossible decisions. Azrith's wrath is upon us all, but I won't let it consume you. In a sudden, desperate act, Elian turned on the cultists who had been closing in, his magic flaring in a dazzling display of light and shadow. The battle was fierce and chaotic, the desert night alive with clashing steel and whispered incantations. When the dust settled, Elian lay wounded but resolute, his betrayal tempered by a sacrifice that rekindled the fragile hope within Kalen and Myra. Kalen's doubts began to dissolve, replaced by a burgeoning resolve. He understood now that the burden of the bone flute was not just his alone to bear. Together with Myra, and even Elian, flawed and conflicted, they could stand against the darkness rising from the desert's depths. The desert held its breath, the winds carrying the echoes of the night's violence and the fragile promise of dawn. Cullen's fingers brushed the flute once more, the notes rising in a somber song that spoke of fractured loyalties, the weight of legacy, and the courage to face an uncertain future. As the first light of dawn spilled over the sands, the bard's melody lingered, a haunting blend of sorrow and hope that wove through the air, binding their fates to the eternal song of the desert. The desert twilight stretched wide and deep, the sun dipping beneath the horizon as shadows grew long and the air cooled with the coming night. Kalen stood alone atop the highest dune, the bone flute cradled carefully in his hands, its ivory surface worn smooth by countless years, buried beneath the sands. The weight of the moment pressed upon him like the heavy mantle of the desert night, a burden he had come to understand all too well. His fingers trembled slightly as he raised the flute to his lips. Around him, the desert held its breath, as if the very wind and sand anticipated what was to come. The spirits that had stirred with his music, the gods whose slumber he had disturbed, all waited on the cusp of silence and song. Kellen's heart beat a slow, steady rhythm, matching the pulse of the earth beneath his feet. He began to play. The melody was unlike any he had summoned before, a soft, mournful tune that wove through the air like a whispered goodbye. Each note carried the sorrow of the forgotten, the weight of power too vast for mortal hands. As the sound unfurled, it shimmered with magic, a delicate thread of sound that braided itself into the very fabric of the desert night. Below, Myra stood watchful, her dark eyes fixed upward, her body tense but steady. The desert guardian's usual fierceness softened by the solemnity of the moment. She felt the magic wrap around her like a cloak, a gentle but unyielding force that spoke of endings and beginnings. Her hands rested lightly on the curved dagger at her belt, a symbol of protection, but also a reminder of the sacrifices made to keep the desert safe. Not far from her, Elian leaned against the fractured ruins of an ancient wall, the last rays of sunlight catching the silver strands of his hair. His sly grin was absent now, replaced by a pensive quiet. The complexities of his loyalties churned beneath his calm exterior, the choices he had made and those still ahead weighing heavily upon him. The desert's silence seemed to echo the uncertainty in his gaze. As Kellen's final note lingered in the air, a profound hush settled over the sands. The restless spirits, who had once flitted and flickered like candle flames in the desert wind, now withdrew, sinking back beneath the dunes with a quiet dignity. The gods' wrath and sorrow, once tangible and fierce, softened into the sand's eternal memory. The bone flute, now silent, felt heavier in Kellen's grasp, a powerful relic bound by a promise never to sing again. He lowered it reverently, understanding that some power was not meant for mortal hands. That legacy sometimes demanded sacrifice. Mira approached, her footsteps light on the cool sands. "You did what had to be done," she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "The desert owes you a debt it cannot repay." Kalen nodded, the echoes of the melody still humming faintly in his heart. "The song may be silent now," he replied, "but its memory will live in the desert wind, carried by those who hear it in the quiet moments between storms." Elian stepped forward, his expression conflicted but respectful. "Perhaps silence is the greatest song of all," he murmured, a melody that protects as much as it warns. The three stood together beneath the gathering stars, bound by the shared weight of their choices. The desert, vast and indifferent, seemed to pulse with a new rhythm, one of fragile peace and uneasy hope. As the night deepened, Kalen wrapped the bone flute in cloth and buried it once more beneath the shifting sands, a final act of guardianship. His journey was far from over, but the melody of the eternal sands had found its silent refrain. And somewhere, deep beneath the dunes, the desert listened. The wind was a low whisper, carrying with it the dry heat of the desert's fading day as Kalen climbed the tallest dune he could find. His fingers curled tightly around the bone flute, the instrument that had rewritten the course of his life and the fate of the desert itself. The sun dipped lower, bleeding orange and blood red across the horizon, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living things across the sand. Each grain shimmered faintly, a tiny mirror to the fading light, and the dry air buzzed with a stillness that felt almost sacred. Kellen's breath came steady but heavy, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like the relentless sun. The flute, carved from bone so pale it almost glowed in the dusk, felt cold and alien in his palm despite the desert's warmth. It was a vessel of ancient power, a key to a forgotten world that had nearly swallowed him whole. And now it was time to bury it, to return it to the silence from which it had been torn. He knelt in the sand and began to dig, his hands working quickly but carefully. The grains slipped through his fingers, some catching on the edges of his weathered skin, but he did not pause. Around him, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with the faintest echo of the flute's last song, a haunting melody that tangled sorrow and hope into a sound that felt less like music and more like memory. From a distance, Mira watched. Her dark eyes were sharp, reflecting the twilight with a wary glow. She stood with her arms crossed, the satchel of herbs at her side, and the curved dagger strapped to her belt, catching the last rays of light. The desert was a place she knew well, its dangers, its secrets, its ancient echoes, and she understood the peril that came with disturbing the bones of gods. Her loyalty to Kalen was fierce, forged in shared trials and the silent understanding of what was at stake. She shifted her weight, the soft crunch of sand beneath her boots, the only sound breaking the stillness. Her heart was heavy with relief that the bone flute's power would be sealed away, but beneath that was a steady pulse of fear of what might happen if the fragile balance was broken again. A sudden movement caught her eye. Elian emerged from the shadows, his silver hair gleaming faintly under the stars beginning to prick the sky. His usual sly grin was absent, replaced by an expression of contemplative acceptance. His faded desert robes fluttered in the rising breeze as he approached quietly, nodding to Kaelin with a respect that felt earned. "It's done then," Elian said softly, his voice low but clear, carrying the weight of unspoken history. "The gods rest once more, for now." Kaelin looked up, meeting Elian's gaze with tired eyes. "For now," he echoed. "The desert holds its secrets well, but peace is never certain." Together, the three watched as Kaelin covered the final handfuls of sand over the flute. The grains seemed to swallow the bone whole, erasing its presence from the surface, but not from memory. The desert exhaled, a silent, ancient breath, as if the very earth recognized the sealing of a long-held wound. The stars above grew brighter, their cold light sparkling like distant watchers, keeping vigil over the buried power beneath the dunes. The wind picked up, carrying the faintest hint of melody, an echo of the flute's voice, a whisper of the desert's eternal song. Kaelin rose slowly, the weight in his chest mingling with a fragile hope. He was no longer just a wandering bard. He was a keeper of stories, a bearer of legacy, and a guardian of secrets that stretched back to the dawn of time. The desert would remember him, as it would remember the gods sleeping beneath its sands. Myra stepped forward, her eyes meeting Kellen's with a steady reassurance. "The desert is quiet again," she said. "For now, we can rest." Elian's gaze lingered on the horizon, where shadows danced beneath the fading light. "But the sands are never still," he murmured, "and the past has a way of reaching out." Kaelin nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within him. The bone flute was buried, its power sealed away, but the melody of the desert, of forgotten gods and ancient wrath, would never fully fade. It lived on in the silence, in the wind, and in the hearts of those who dared to listen. As the three figures turned away from the doom, the desert resumed its timeless vigil. The night stretched on, vast and indifferent, filled with whispers only the patient and the brave could hear. And somewhere beneath the shifting sands, the bone flute slept its secret song, waiting for the day it might once again be called forth. But for now, the desert was silent, and Kaelin walked forward, carrying the weight of forgotten power and the melodies of a world both lost and found. The first light of dawn spilled gently over the endless dunes, painting the desert in hues of soft pink and gold. Kaelin sat upon a high ridge of sand, the coolness of the early morning still clinging to the grains beneath him. His fingers brushed the strings of a worn lute, coaxing forth a melody that was at once fragile and enduring a song born not from the bone flute's haunting summons, but from the deep well of memory and hope that had taken root within him. The desert, with all its ancient secrets and silent watchfulness, seemed to lean closer, carrying the notes on a breath of wind that stirred the shifting sands. Cullen's eyes, clouded with the weight of what had been and what might still be, reflected the dawning sky. This was no longer the music of summoning or fear. It was a new song, one that honored the past without beckoning its shadows. From the quiet distance, Mira approached, her steps gentle, the soft rustle of her dark cloak barely disturbing the sand. Her sharp eyes softened as she listened, her presence a steady anchor beside him. "Your music," she said, her voice low and warm. "It carries the desert's spirit, but also your own." Kaelin nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint, tired smile. "I want to tell the stories differently now, not as warnings or curses, but as threads binding us to the land and each other." He paused, his gaze tracing the horizon where the sun crept higher. "A desert's voice is vast and patient. If I listen closely, I can hear the echoes of those who came before us, not just gods and spirits, but the people who lived and loved here." Myra settled beside him, drawing a small satchel closer. "My ancestors guarded these sacred places, not to keep others away, but to remind us what must be protected, not just with swords, but with memory and song. Their conversation wove seamlessly with the rising sun, their words and music blending into the morning air. As the day grew warmer, a flicker of movement caught Kellen's eye. Across the dunes appeared Elian, his tall figure framed by the shimmering heat. His silver hair glinted like a mirage, and the sly grin that often played on his lips was tempered now by something softer, more genuine. He approached slowly, hands raised in a cautious greeting. "Your song carries far, Kalen. It speaks of hope, even in the shadows that linger." Kalen regarded him thoughtfully. "And you, what do you hear when you listen to it?" Elian's smile deepened, a rare moment of openness, a chance that the desert story doesn't end with silence or ruin. The three shared a moment of quiet understanding, an unspoken truce born from shared trials, and the fragile promise of what might yet be. As the sun climbed higher, Kalen felt the weight of the past settling gently upon his shoulders, transformed from a burden into a mantle of responsibility. Night crept over the desert once more, and around a modest campfire, Kalen's new melodies rose softly into the vast silence. The music held no summons for the dead, no call to forgotten gods. Instead, it was a bridge, a song of memory and renewal, threading the lives of those who had come before with those who would walk the sands long after the flute's voice had faded. In the flickering firelight, faces worn by the desert's harshness softened with the glow of hope. Mira hummed along, her fingers tracing patterns in the sand, while Elian watched from the shadows, a quiet guardian in his own right. Kellen's song lingered in the night air, a haunting blend of awe and melancholy that promised the desert stories were far from over. The melodies carried on the wind, a testament to the enduring power of music to awaken not only the dead, but the deepest parts of the soul. As the final notes faded into the vastness, Kalen knew that though the bone flute lay silent beneath the shifting sands, the desert's new song had only just begun. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the eternal sands listened, waiting for the next melody to rise. The desert held its breath, and the music, fragile, fierce, and full of life, continued to echo across the endless dunes. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the endless sea of sand. Atop a towering dune, Kalen and Mira stood side by side, silhouettes carved against the amber sky. The desert breathed around them, silent save for the whisper of the wind that carried faint notes of a melody, soft and tentative, yet filled with a promise that resonated in the heart of the barren lands. Myra's sharp eyes, usually so guarded and fierce, softened as she turned to Kalen. "I must return," she said quietly, her voice steady, but touched with a depth of feeling that betrayed the weight of her decision. "The guardianship is not mine alone, but it is my burden to bear. The desert needs protectors, those willing to stand between its secrets and those who would exploit them." Kalen nodded, the bone flute resting in his hand, silent now, but still heavy with memory. "You have grown stronger through this journey," he replied, his voice warm with respect. "And so have I. Our paths, once solitary and uncertain, have crossed for a reason." The breeze lifted strands of his sun-bleached hair, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and distant rain, a fleeting hope amid desolation. He thought of the melodies that had once seemed like curses, summoning spirits and stirring gods from their ancient slumber. Now, those same notes felt like a call to something greater, a legacy written not in sandstorms or shadows, but in the stories shared beneath the endless sky. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in hues of gold and crimson, a figure emerged from the edges of the campfire's glow. Elian's silver hair shimmered in the moonlight, his sly grin replaced by a look of quiet resolve. Without a word, he approached Kalen, eyes searching for something unspoken between them. "This is where we part," Elian said softly, his voice a mixture of farewell and gratitude. "The desert holds many secrets, and my path lies apart from yours now. But know this, Our stories are intertwined, and your music will echo long after I am gone." Kaelin placed a hand on Elian's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey. "May your path be clear, Elian, and if ever the desert calls you back, you will find a place among us." With a final lingering glance, Elian turned toward the vast darkness of the desert, his figure swallowed by the shifting sands and star-studded night. The campfire's embers flickered, casting dancing shadows that whispered of promises kept and debts owed. Left beneath the solitary acacia tree, Kaelin cradled a new instrument, its strings warm beneath his fingertips, an extension of his soul. He closed his eyes and began to play, the melody weaving through the cool night air like a thread binding past and future. It sang of gods and mortals, of forgotten wars and enduring hope, of a desert that was both graveyard and cradle. Each note was a step forward, a bridge across the chasms of time and memory. The stars above shimmered in approval, their light a silent chorus to the bard's song. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of footsteps stirred the sand. On the horizon, a caravan of figures crested a distant dune, their silhouettes fragile against the dawn's first light. Among them, a young girl with eyes wide with wonder, Nim, the scavenger who had become an unlikely ally. Her gaze was fixed on the glowing sky, a spark of determination kindling within her. The desert's endless dance continued, timeless and unyielding. But now, with each note carried on the wind, the sands whispered not only of forgotten gods and buried powers, but of new beginnings and stories yet to be told. Kellen's music was no longer a solitary lament. It was a living legacy, a melody that would endure through the eternal sands. And as the first rays of sunlight touched the earth, the bard smiled, knowing that his journey was no longer one of solitude, but of connection. A song shared, a path joined, and a future shaped by the harmony of past and present. The desert waited, listening. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the village nestled at the edge of the endless dunes. The air shimmered with heat, heavy and still, as if the desert itself held its breath. Dust swirled in lazy eddies along the cracked pathways, carrying with it murmurs and whispers, stories that had taken root like ancient bones beneath the sand. Kaelin walked slowly, his footsteps stirring the fine particles, his eyes tracing the worn faces of villagers who glanced furtively toward him, their voices hushed but thick with curiosity and fear. The tales of the bone flute, the shrouded god, and the battle that had once threatened to unravel the desert's fragile peace had not faded completely. Instead, they persisted as murmurs, half-remembered songs on the lips of those who dared speak them. Kaelin knew these whispers well. They were the desert's way of reminding all who lived here that beneath the Azi, shifting sands lay power both terrible and beautiful, a power that had been silenced but never truly forgotten. Passing a small marketplace where the air was fragrant with sun-baked spices and dried herbs, Kaelin caught sight of a figure darting between stalls. A slight movement, a quick glance, and then a cautious step forward. The boy was small, wiry, with skin bronzed by the harsh sun, and eyes that gleamed with a mixture of wonder and determination. He moved with the nimbleness of someone who had grown up knowing the desert's unforgiving nature. A scavenger by trade, perhaps, but something more in his gaze. "You're Kaelin," the boy said, voice barely above the hum of the marketplace. The bard who played the flute that spoke to the dead. Kaelin studied him for a moment, the weight of countless journeys reflected in his tired eyes. "And you are?" "Nim," the boy replied, stepping closer, his hand brushing a leather satchel slung across his shoulder. "I've heard the stories. About the flute, the gods, the desert. They say the music can wake the past. Can it?" A faint smile touched Kellen's lips, bittersweet and slow. "Yes," he said softly, "it can. But the past is a dangerous thing to awaken." They settled by a crumbling stone well, its edges cracked and worn smooth by countless seasons. Nim's gaze was steady, unafraid, filled with the kind of fearless curiosity that comes from knowing the desert's secrets are as much a part of you as your own breath. "Why did you stop playing?" Nim asked, voice laced with both wonder and sadness. Kalin looked out over the dunes, where the sun's dying light set the sand ablaze in hues of gold and crimson. "Because some melodies are meant to rest," he replied. "Because power without balance can consume everything it touches." A sudden gust of wind swept across the sands, lifting grains into a swirling dance that caught the fading light. For a moment, faint echoes of an ancient melody seemed to ripple through the air, brushing against Kellen's senses like a ghost's caress. Memories long buried stirred within him, the haunting tunes that had once summoned spirits, the weight of God's wrath, the fragile hope that had kept him walking forward. Nim watched him quietly, sensing the depth of the unspoken words, the history etched into the bard's soul. "Will the music ever return?" Nim asked. Kalin reached into his satchel and pulled out a small wooden flute, simple and unadorned, carved with the gentle curves of desert vines. He handed it to Nim, the gesture heavy with meaning. "The music never truly leaves," Kalin said. "It waits for those who listen, those brave enough to carry its burden." Nim took the flute with reverence, fingers tracing the worn patterns as the desert sky faded into twilight. Stars began to twinkle overhead, ancient and eternal, as if watching over the passing of a torch. "Will you teach me?" Nim asked, eyes bright with hope. Kalin nodded, a quiet resolve settling within him. "I will, but remember, the desert listens, and its songs are not easily forgotten." As night embraced the village, the two figures sat beneath the vast canvas of stars, a bard and a boy, bound by melody and memory, guardians of a legacy as old as the sands themselves. The whispers in the sand stirred once more, carrying with them the promise of new songs yet to be sung. The desert held its secrets close, but in the meeting of these two souls, the cycle of memory and melody continued, a haunting blend of hope and melancholy that would shape the days to come. And somewhere, beneath the endless dunes, the echoes of the bone flute lingered, waiting patiently for the next hand to awaken its voice. The wind shifted again, soft and steady, as if the desert itself was listening and ready to sing once more. The dawn spilled slowly over the vast desert, the horizon bleeding hues of gold and rose that kissed the endless waves of sand. Kalin sat alone atop a high dune, the bone flute long since silenced beneath the earth, replaced now by the soft strumming of his lute. His fingers moved deftly, weaving a melody that was at once fragile and enduring, a song born of the desert's silence and the ancient voices it had carried through time. The notes drifted on the warm air, a haunting thread that stitched together the memories of sun-baked stones, whispered legends, and the echo of gods now only found in dreams. Kellen's eyes, deep pools of sorrow and hope, scanned the horizon where sand met sky, and somewhere beneath that vastness, the spirits he had once awakened settled again into their eternal slumber. But Kalin was no longer the solitary wanderer who had stumbled upon the bone flute. His journey had carved him into a guardian of memory, a bard whose music was a bridge between worlds. Each melody he composed was an offering to the gods who had shaped the desert, to the people who lived beneath its relentless sun, and to the restless spirits that lingered just beyond sight. The village of Al-Qamar awaited him as the sun climbed higher. Word had spread of the bard whose songs held the weight of forgotten power, and a crowd gathered beneath a canopy of palm fronds and the azure sky. Kellen's voice rose steady and clear, carrying the tales of ancient wars and whispered warnings of love lost and hope rekindled. The villagers listened, their faces softened by firelight and tears, the music bridging generations and healing wounds that time alone could not touch. Among them, Nim, A young scavenger with bright eyes and a heart open to wonder sat entranced. To Nim, Kellen's songs were not just stories. They were lifelines, threads connecting her to a heritage almost lost in the shifting sands. When the final note faded into the night, she approached the bard with a shy smile, her voice a quiet question about the future. Kalen met her gaze and saw reflected there the same yearning that had driven him across the barren wastes. "The desert sings its secrets to those who listen," he said softly, "and now it sings through you." In the days that followed, Kalen and Mira walked together through sacred ruins, places where the war of gods had left scars etched deep into stone and sand. Myra's hand rested lightly on Kellen's shoulder, grounding him in the present as he hummed a tune that seemed to awaken the very stones beneath their feet. The melody was a vow, a promise that the past would not be forgotten, and that the guardianship of these hallowed places was a sacred trust shared between them. Myra's eyes, sharp and fierce, softened for a moment as she spoke. "You carry more than music, Kalen. You carry the legacy of those who came before, and with it, the hope of those who will come after." Kalen nodded, feeling the weight of that truth settle comfortably upon his shoulders. The power of the bone flute was gone, buried beneath the sands, but the spirit it had awakened lived on in his songs, in the memories they preserved, in the futures they inspired. One evening, as twilight bled into night, Elian approached the edge of camp, his silver hair catching the last light like strands of moonlight. His sly grin was tempered now by a hint of sadness, a man forever caught between shadows and light. Without a word, he turned toward the desert's vast embrace, his silhouette fading into the horizon. Kalen lifted his lute and played a final, haunting melody, a benediction and a question lingering in the cool night air. The music sailed across the dunes, a farewell to a companion whose path was forever uncertain, and a reminder that some stories never truly end. As the notes faded into silence, Kalen looked to the stars, feeling the pulse of the desert beneath his feet and the melody of the eternal sands within his heart. The journey had changed him. The weight of forgotten gods was now a part of him, woven into every song he would ever sing. The desert held its secrets close, but through Kellen's music, those secrets would live on whispered across the dunes, carried on the wind, and etched into the souls of all who listened. The bard's legacy was not just in the past he remembered, but in the future he dared to dream. And as the first notes of a new song rose with the dawn, the desert stirred once more, not with the wrath of gods, but with the hopeful breath of a story just beginning. The sun began its slow descent, casting a molten glow across the endless waves of sand that stretched as far as the eye could see. Kalen stood at the crest of a towering dune, the bone flute resting lightly in his hands. The air was cool now, a gentle breeze sweeping the desert's breath beneath the sky painted with streaks of amber and rose. Around him, silence reigned, a vast, profound quiet that seemed to listen as intently as he did. His fingers hovered over the carved bones, each note etched with the weight of 1,000 forgotten years. The flute was no longer just an instrument. It was a key to a past too heavy to bear, a voice that had sung the rise and fall of gods long buried beneath the shifting sands. Tonight, he would play one last time. The first note slipped from his lips, fragile yet resonant, a thread weaving through the stillness. It was a melody born of sorrow and hope, a lament for the lost and a prayer for the living. As the notes unfurled, the desert seemed to breathe deeper, the sand beneath his feet stirring with faint whispers that danced like shadows in the fading light. Memories flooded his mind, the restless spirits summoned in the storm, the towering presence of Azareth cloaked in shifting shadows, the fierce determination in Myra's eyes, and the conflicted glance Elian had cast before vanishing into the dunes. Each memory was a note in a symphony of ancient power and human frailty. Myra stood a little way off, her dark eyes reflecting the twilight. She carried the weight of her lineage with quiet grace, her presence a steady anchor amidst the swirling tides of magic and destiny. Elian lingered nearby, his sly grin softened by a rare moment of sincerity, the faded robes of a traveler who had walked the fine line between betrayal and redemption. Together, they had weathered storms both literal and figurative, but now the journey was drawing to its inevitable close. Kellen's melody wove through the desert like a thread of light in the encroaching dusk, each note a farewell to the power he had borne and a promise to the land he had come to love. The final note lingered in the air, fragile and trembling, before dissolving into the quiet. The desert exhaled, the restless spirits retreating into the sands, their voices silenced, but their stories imprinted in the heartbeats of the earth. Kalen laid the bone flute carefully on the dune's crest, the intricate carvings catching the last glimmers of sunlight before the wind swept it gently beneath the shifting sands. A profound stillness settled over the landscape, a peace born not of forgetfulness, but of understanding. The power of the flute was buried once more, locked away from mortal hands, but alive in the melodies that stirred the soul and whispered through the dunes. Kalen turned away from the resting place, his steps slow but steady. The desert stretched before him, vast and eternal, a living testament to the dance of memory and melody, life and death. The weight of forgotten gods rested lightly on his shoulders now, carried with the quiet dignity of one who had seen beyond the veil. As twilight deepened into night, the stars emerged silent witnesses to the bard's final song. Somewhere in the distance, the faintest breeze carried his melody across the sands, a haunting blend of awe and melancholy that would echo in the hearts of those who dared to listen. Mira caught his gaze and nodded, a shared understanding passing between them. Elian's silhouette faded into the gathering shadows, his path uncertain but forever touched by the journey they had shared. Kellen's journey was far from over, but the bone flute's voice was stilled. The desert held its secrets close, but its eternal song had found a new bearer, one who would carry its melody forward in stories and dreams, in the quiet moments when the sands whispered beneath the stars. And so, atop the highest dune, with the last light fading and the desert listening, Kalen played the melody of the eternal sands, a song of endings and beginnings, of silence and sound, of memory and hope. The flute was silent, but the music lived on. The melody lingered in the air, a haunting reminder that some powers, once awakened, never truly fade. They only wait for the right moment to sing again.